Hello, I'm Ben Ogles. I'm the primary developer of the Ohio Youth Problem Severity, Functioning, and Satisfaction Scales, also known as the Ohio Scales. Today's presentation was developed for frontline clinicians and community support workers who provide services for children with mental health problems and their families. Today we will focus on using the Ohio Scales to engage and empower families in the treatment planning and treatment evaluation process. Charlotte Williams,
Hello.
a family advocate and former wraparound facilitator, will be working with me today. Together, we hope this video training will provide you with specific ideas about how to integrate outcomes assessment into everyday clinical work with families. Before we get started, we also want you to know that we created a set of handouts and exercises that go along with this training that will be useful to you during the training. These handouts will either be available on the web in PDF format or on the DVD that you've received with the training on it. It would be useful for you to get them now. In addition, PowerPoint slides are integrated into the presentation and are available for printout. We hope you enjoy the presentation. Before we get started, there's one other matter of business. We'd like to thank the Office of Program Evaluation and Research within the Ohio Department of Mental Health, along with the Southern Consortium for Children and the agencies and families who participated in developing the Ohio Scales, along with the many students, both undergraduate and graduate students at Ohio University, who were a part of the development of the Ohio Scales and provided much input about their utility. If providers don't measure outcome, someone else will. This quotation expresses the reality of today's service delivery oriented world. Although providers of services may be reluctant to expend the resources to develop outcomes assessment, a climate of scarce resources and increased accountability is forcing many agencies in a number of different areas to be involved in outcomes assessment. With this training, we hope to illustrate how it will not only be useful to you in terms of meeting those demands for outcome assessment, but also how you can use it in individual treatment to evaluate services with the current individual and family receiving the services. Even beyond that, Charlotte will be here providing important input about how to use outcome measures to better engage and empower families in treatment planning and the evaluation process. With that overarching goal in mind, we will first provide an introduction to outcomes assessment and the movement of outcomes. We'll then introduce you to the ODMH Consumer Outcome System and more specifically the Ohio Scales. And then we'll use the remainder of the time and the bulk of the time introducing you to the ways in which you can use the Ohio Scales to engage families in treatment planning and tracking progress of treatment. Let's get started. Perhaps this introduction to outcomes assessment is unnecessary. It's hard to imagine that anyone viewing this training would be unfamiliar with the fact that outcomes and outcomes assessment has been percolating around for nearly 2 decades. In many service delivery systems, a focus on accountability and efficiency has combined to focus many individuals and organizations on outcomes assessment. This is not limited to so-called behavioral health or mental health services, but is also in education, in the medical field, and other areas. It affects both publicly funded and privately funded organizations. It involves people who deliver the services, who receive the services, and those who administer the services and pay for the services. It's resulted in a variety of books and articles and essays and other publications about the topic. In short, we're in the midst of a significant outcomes movement. Here's one example from healthcare. Programs focused on outcomes research, measurement, and management have emerged over the past decade as a result of rapidly rising healthcare costs, questions about the effectiveness of medical intervention, and the need for efficient delivery of care. Even with this focus, however, some may still ask, why would we assess outcome? I would suggest there are 4 reasons that we engage in outcomes assessment. First, to try and improve treatment. This implies improving treatment for the individual in our office right now and for those who receive the treatment in the future. We also assess outcome to investigate our theories of change and to better understand the factors that are related to change in a scientific way. We assess outcome to be accountable to those who consume and pay for or oversee our services. And finally, we assess outcome because we have an ethical obligation to be responsible for the quality of the services that we deliver. With this background about outcomes assessment then, let us now turn to the outcomes system of the state of Ohio that was developed by the Ohio Department of Mental Health with input from many constituencies. And we'll focus specifically on the outcomes system for youth. During the 1990s, a diverse group of stakeholders were organized in the state of Ohio to develop a statewide outcomes evaluation system. The history of this group and the series of initiatives that followed are well documented at the Ohio Department of Mental Health website on the outcome portion. The address, the URL for this website, is listed at the end of the presentation. I will not go into the details of the system development, but we will touch on some key points. The state of Ohio now uses, after this lengthy process, a core group of outcome measures to assess outcomes for statewide for all publicly funded mental health services. With the implementation, there is a concurrent move to reduce process measurement and increase a move towards outcomes-driven management, including shifting accreditation of agencies to CARF, COA, JCAHO, and others. In addition, there's a commitment to regularly review and improve the outcome system. In fact, this very training was first initiated as a result of that outcome system improvement process. The core measures selected for the outcome system for youth include 3 points of view: the parent or primary caregiver, the youth, and the mental health agency worker. All 3 points of view are assessed using the Ohio scales. The Ohio scales were selected in part because they provide measures of outcome in a format that includes multiple perspectives, the parent, youth, and agency worker, multiple content areas, problem severity, functioning, satisfaction, and hopefulness, and because they're practical yet psychometrically sound. The parent-rated Ohio scales consists of 4 content areas: problem severity, functioning, hopefulness, and satisfaction. Each form of the Ohio scales is 2 pages total in its original format, could be back-to-back or 2 pages, with some basic demographic questions on the top of the first page, followed by the 20 problem severity items. On the second page are the 4-item hopefulness and satisfaction scales, and below that, the 20-item functioning scale, which asks parents to rate the level of functioning of the child across the range of areas of functioning, from recreation to hygiene to relationships. Each of these 3 scales is included in the handouts. The parent scale has a P in the upper right-hand corner. The youth form of the Ohio scales has a Y in the upper right-hand corner with the same format and the same scales. The hopefulness and satisfaction scales are worded slightly differently, where the youth rates their own hopefulness while the parent rates their hopefulness about parenting a child. The youth rates their own satisfaction. The parent rates their satisfaction with the services that their child is receiving. The problem severity and functioning items are identical. The agency worker form has a W in the upper right-hand corner and contains the identical problem severity and functioning scales as the youth and parent forms. In addition, the agency worker completes the roles, the restrictiveness of living environments scale that was developed by Hawkins and collaborators at West Virginia University, and several other additional items. Details of the definitions for each item can be found on the ODMH website. I will not go into the details of the psychometric characteristics of the Ohio scales. I provide in the slides references to 3 sets of published materials that detail the reliability, validity, sensitivity to change, and other psychometric data regarding the Ohio scales. Those who are interested can seek out those publications or contact me. In the state of Ohio, the Ohio scales are to be administered at admission, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, or termination, whichever comes first. A parent or primary caregiver will rate the child using the parent form. Children between 5 and 18 are rated by the parent. It could be a foster parent, or in some instances, a relative or the children's caseworker that has the closest to a parental point of view. The youth rates themselves if they are 12 or older. Here's a few words of advice about administration. First, it's important to administer the scales as soon as possible in the treatment process. Individuals coming into treatment often begin to feel better even after making the very first appointment. In order to capture the entire amount of change that occurs as a result of treatment, it's important to get them as soon as possible when they're the most distressed. This requires administering the scales as soon as possible, maybe even as part of the financial intake before they ever see any of the clinical staff. Second, the scales can be read to individuals who have trouble reading, and you can provide assistance to them. You could even engage in a dialogue with them where they complete the scales as you have a discussion with the parent about it. The forms are also available in other languages, and in fact, parents and clinicians often learn and complete the forms together in a collaborative process. Third, the agency worker can wait until they have sufficient information to rate the child. They should think about rating the child at their initial point in time when they came into treatment. But it may take them a few contacts and even some contact with others outside the family, such as a probation officer or school teacher, before they feel like they have sufficient information to rate the child using the forms. My general rule of thumb is that if the agency worker feels like they have sufficient information to create a treatment plan, then they would also be able to rate the child at the point at which they entered treatment. Fourth, and finally, rating the forms is not enough. Developing a process for using the forms with the family to make treatment decisions and gather important information is also necessary. Remaining portions of this presentation will give you some ideas about how to do that. And Charlotte will give you some tips about administration for the family.
When you administer the forms to parents, make sure that you give them a simple description of the uses of the scale. Clinicians are used to filling out forms. They know how necessary it is, but to parents, they often find it very frustrating. They need to know that you're going to use the form, you're going to return to it, that what they say is meaningful to the treatment of their child.
To score the forms, you add up the items for each of the 4 scales: problem severity, functioning, hopefulness, and satisfaction. If there are more than 4 items missing on either the problem severity or functioning scale, then you do not calculate a total score for those scales. If any items are missing for satisfaction or hopefulness, then you do not calculate a total score for those scales. You will notice that there are no reversed scored items, so you simply add up the items for functioning and problem severity. If you have fewer than 4 or fewer on problem severity or functioning, then you use the table to calculate the total. Add up the items that they have endorsed and find that score. Look at in the table at the column headings for the number of items that are missed, and then identify the total score for the scale. Simply use the table to find what the total score is. Typically, I count up the number of 4s, 3s, etc., and multiply them as illustrated in this slide. This way you can quickly get a total score for problem severity or functioning. Just count up the number of 3s, multiply by 3, and put it at the bottom, then sum the columns together to get your total score. Typically, if you have missing data, you would contact the person also to find out why they left the item blank. Parents of young children also wonder sometimes about the items relating to work or earning money on the functioning scale. To help them talk about what would be age appropriate for the item. Completing simple chores for an allowance or small amounts of money would be reasonable functioning for a young child, while it would not be for an older child. Ask the parent to rate the item and their child while considering their current developmental level. Take a look at the handout of George J. and see how I would calculate the total scores for his ratings. This is the first case example. One final comment. The scoring for the roles is more complicated and will not be covered here. Typically, the clinician does not use the total score but uses the information in the roles. The scoring is then automated when the data is entered. In addition, some agencies will use automated scoring, so you may have it scannable forms or such like that. In those cases, you'll get the total scores immediately from the machinery. There's also a free ODMH Access database that's available online to use for entering and scoring the data. The only requirement, of course, is that you have Microsoft Access on your computer. Now that you have the scores, the question then becomes, how do you use the data? It's not sufficient use of the data if the only way we use it is to average it across many individuals and then use it at the program or state or agency level. The point is to use it as a clinician with the individual and family that you have in your office today. We'll describe a set protocol that's listed on the slide for using the data that can be quickly learned and used. A handout also describes the 5 main steps plus some additional summary steps. We'll first describe each step and then illustrate them using the case of George J. Then we'll take a break and let you try out the protocol using a new case, Roberta. Importantly, each of these steps should be used to collaboratively engage the family in the treatment planning process. Now for our first step. After scoring the form, the first thing to do is to look at items 7, 8, 12, and 13. These critical items include issues that, if endorsed, may require additional assessment and/or immediate action. If, for example, the youth endorsed having thoughts of death as a 3 or a 4, the agency worker would likely follow up to see the extent of the youth's thoughts of death and take action as appropriate. The point here is to first screen the youth on these critical items to see if further assessment and action may be necessary. The next slide shows the parent ratings of George J. for items 7 to 13. You can also look at the entire problem severity rating for the parent in the handouts. As illustrated in this slide, only one item is rated as a 2, the breaking rules or breaking the law. This should be considered within the context of the intake, and you may need or want to take action in that case.
In addition, if you have a large discrepancy between the youth and the parent, you need to have a dialogue with the parent at that time. Children today have their own world, their own language, their own music, and very often there's a gap between what we understand as parents and what children are really meaning in their language. So it's important to find out if parents are available or present enough to even know what's going on with their children.
In addition to examining the critical items, the next step is to identify target problems. By examining the individual items on the problem severity scale, the agency worker may identify some specific issues or clusters of issues that the parent has identified that may be potential targets for treatment. In some cases, it may be one target problem, like arguing. In other cases, it may be several related items that cluster together or hang together that indicate something like distractibility or disruptive behaviors or oppositional behaviors. In some cases, the target problem will not even be on the scale, something such as encopresis. Nevertheless, there are related items that may identify secondary targets for treatment. Importantly, once you identify the potential targets, it's useful to discuss this with the family in order to fine-tune the direction of the treatment plan. Many research studies use individualized measures such as this, such as the Treatment for Depression Collaborative Research Program study, and then they track change on those individual items. Using the items to identify targets gives you an automatic way to assess outcome on those individual items over time. If you turn again to the handout for George J., you can see some of the potential targets for treatment from the parent rating. You'll see that there's a collection of disruptive behaviors such as arguing, yelling, causing trouble for no reason, skipping school, and lying. These could be listed individually as targets of treatment, or they could be combined together to create one set of disruptive behaviors that are then the target of treatment.
Also, you need to find out from the family if there are issues that are not on the forms but are critical to that family and the structure of their home. This is a standard form, but families are unique. It is important to get their feelings about what is most important to them. You must be culturally competent as well as culturally sensitive.
At the very least, you want to be able to have them rank order the issues that they list from the target problems. Now, in addition to identifying targets for treatment and looking at the critical items, you can also identify functional strengths. To do this, you can look at the functioning scale and identify those items that have been endorsed by either the child or the parent as a 3, okay functioning, or a 4, doing very well on functioning. Again, reviewing these items with the family can lead to fruitful and clinically meaningful discussions that might inform the treatment plan. If you turn to the example of George J., you will see a relationship with friends, caring for personal hygiene, and other health needs as strengths of George that are perceived by his parent. In addition to identifying those strengths, we can connect them to the resilience literature. To provide some context, I'm going to go on a very brief tangent here regarding resilience, even though an entire training could be conducted on this topic. First, resilience is based on research regarding the factors that allow youth to excel in spite of formidable obstacles. Some examples of these characteristics are included in the next slide. A variety of characteristics are associated with resilience, and some items in the scales may be indirect and somewhat crude indicators of those characteristics. Further discussion with the family can identify additional youth strengths. In addition to the characteristics of children, other factors contribute to resilience. For the most part, the Ohio scales do not tap into these external factors. I include them here to remind the agency worker that a variety of family and other factors should be considered with the data from the measures to plan treatment and identify strengths. Here are a few items that do match up with resilience factors. Other items could be mapped into resilience based on the clinician's experience.
When you are with a family, you may need to help them see that a strength can be something they might normally look at as just an everyday occurrence, but for that child, it is a strength. You need to be sensitive to the fact that parents may be in a place where it's hard for them to see the good because of the stress and the pressure that the family has been involved in. You may also want to help parents to rethink some of the items and identify strengths that they would not normally call a strength. You should also consider or not whether children and families have opportunities to engage in strengthening activities in the community.
In addition to looking at the critical items, targets for treatment, identifying areas of functioning, we can also look at the total score of the problem severity or functioning to look at the level of severity and then to potentially match that up with the level of intensity of services. The total score can also be plotted at intake and then tracked over time. In addition, initial scores can be examined to see if they are in the clinical range, or more significantly, if they are in the mild, moderate, severe, or extreme range. In the next slide, we show the numbers that were developed in a calibration study with the Child and Adolescent Functional Assessment Scale. We see the cutoffs for both parent and adults, and turn it 1/4 turn counterclockwise. The first 11 items demonstrate an externalizing pattern, and the last 9 items would demonstrate an internalizing pattern. You can see then either an internalizing, externalizing, mixed, or none of the above pattern in the scale. In addition to this, we can compare the youth and parent ratings to see if there's any discrepancy in their scores. In general, children with internalizing problems, that is depression and anxiety and the like, tend to rate higher than the parents because those symptoms they're aware of and the parents may or may not be aware of. While children with externalizing types of problems, such as conduct problems, disruptive behaviors, the parents tend to rate higher. They see those behaviors, and the children tend to downplay them and see them not as much of a problem as the parents do. Examining discrepancies and looking at the factors that are associated with discrepancy can be quite useful clinically. In this figure, you see discrepancy illustrated in a graph format for a sample of 2,100 children and parents from a sample in California. As you can see, parents in this sample tend to rate their children about 1 or 2 points higher than the children rate themselves. But there can be quite large discrepancies, as much as 15 points or more. When the differences are large, especially larger than 15 points, it may be especially important to investigate that during face-to-face contacts to find some of the potential reasons for the discrepancy. There are also a variety of factors that are associated with differences. For example, girls tend to agree more with their parents than do boys on total scores. On the other hand, boys tend to agree more with their parents than girls on the individual items. In other words, the girls might have the same total score. The overall level of severity is the same, but the parents might say they have a problem in this area while the daughter says they have a problem in this area. On the other hand, with boys, they agree on which problems they have, but the boys tend to rate lower than the parent tends to rate higher. Discrepancy is also related to treatment persistence. Youth and parents who have bigger differences in their total scores on the problem severity scale are more likely to drop out of treatment. And if the parent ratings are higher, the child is more likely to have a poor outcome.
This is a good place to engage parents in a conversation about 2 key issues. Pinpoint the reasons for the large discrepancies in the scores, and 2, what things have they tried in the past? What treatments have they tried? What things have they found to work and not work in their home?
This collection of information that we've discussed, the critical items, target problems, functional strengths, level of severity, comparing the parent and youth scores, can then be used in any face-to-face contacts. Look at those and also look at the internalizing, externalizing pattern, and then combine that with collateral contacts, the interview with the child, the meeting with the family.
Have handouts such as an asset list and other aids to help the parent. For overwhelmed parents, it's difficult to have the energy that's required to build optimism and to build skills and strengths in their children. Remember to look at scores on the hopefulness scale and be prepared to build optimism and hope if needed. Of course, all these things can be standardized, can't be completed without the data, but the data can also help to inform the process with a standardized assessment that adds comparative information and an easy method of tracking progress.
With the completed information from the parent and youth, and with the added clinical and collateral contacts, the agency worker can then rate the youth using the worker form. Agency workers rate youths from ages 5 to 18. I created a form that guides the use of the Ohio scales for the initial assessment and treatment planning. It describes the protocol that we've just discussed. In your handouts, you have both a blank form that can be copied and used in your work, and an example form with the data from George J. And that case are entered into the form. My experience with this suggests that if you use the form for the protocol with about 4 or 5 cases, it rapidly target family in a conversation about the treatment and treatment planning. I should note that these steps could equally apply to any number of other scales, not just the Ohio scales. They're not unique to the Ohio scales. In addition, this initial use was not the primary reason for the development of the Ohio scales. We were more interested in tracking progress. Nevertheless, the scales can be used to provide assessment information and to plan treatment at intake. Now, to practice, take the additional handouts that I provided for the case of Roberta R. Using the parent and youth ratings, use a blank guide for initial assessment and treatment planning to work through the protocol, just like the George J. case. Pause the training now and work through the practice case. This marks the end of the section on using the Ohio scales at treatment initiation for engaging and empowering the family in treatment planning. We now move on to discuss the use of the scales for tracking progress during treatment. How do we use the Ohio scales to track progress for the individual client and to improve the quality of treatment? We have 3 broad areas to discuss. First, we'll develop a quick protocol similar to the initial assessment and treatment planning protocol that can be used by the clinician for tracking progress with the individual client and family. Then we'll illustrate how data from the Ohio scales might be used in supervision, clinical supervision. And third, we'll briefly illustrate how the data might be used at an aggregate level for management, marketing, or evaluation purposes. We use the bulk of our time on the individual and family protocol, and then briefly touch on the other 2 to give a taste of the types of utility of the data that they may provide. Data from the Ohio scales can be used to track change on individual items and total scores. It can also be used to compare progress across the different scales and domains to assess the degree to which, and also to assess the degree to which clinically meaningful change has occurred. Let us take each topic in order. First, we can track change on the individual items. Very much like the target complaints as used in the Treatment for Depression Collaborative Research Program, you can take one item, such as lying or arguing, assess it at the beginning of treatment, and then assess it 3 months later. If it moves from a 5 to a 3, we have evidence that on those targets of treatment, the child is making progress.
Explain to the parents that these changes could be used much the same way that someone would chart their blood pressure or their blood sugar levels. You can review progress or changes as frequently as needed.
The primary use of the Ohio scales is to track change using the total score. This gives a standardized way to, across all items, all families rating the child using those same items, and then to plot it over time. A blank graph has been provided in the handouts that can be used and copied in this way. In addition, an example using the George J. case has been provided where his initial scores and the second time point scores have been plotted on the graph that could be used in treatment.
Be sure to share the information with the parents themselves with other families. Allow them to define what success will be for them.
Finally, we can use the total scores to estimate if a client has made clinically meaningful improvements. I'd like to take a brief excursion on this topic to illustrate the most common method of examining clinically meaningful change. This is a more technical part of the training, but nonetheless quite an important one. Jacobson and Truax suggest that clinically meaningful change consists of 2 parts. First, the person needs to make a big enough change that it can be considered reliable. In other words, the change is big enough that it's considered real change. It's moving below a score of 20. So in other words, you need to meet both criteria, which are make a change of at least 10 points and move below a score of 20 to be considered having made clinically meaningful change. This can be graphed in such a way as illustrated on the next slide. We can display it visually in this way. In the graph, the pre-treatment score or the intake score is on the x-axis, and the post-treatment score is on the vertical or y-axis. If we plot an individual's location, given where they started and where their most recent score was at post-treatment, and then put it on this graph, we can see whether all on this and look at the percentages of people that made deterioration, improvement, clinically meaningful change, or no change.
This is very technical stuff. Try to find a simple way to explain it to the parent. Don't forget the definitions of success that the family has identified earlier in treatment. What they view as meaningful change may be different from the statistical definition. To review the ways you can use outcome data with the parent, verify parent and youth outcome report in face-to-face contacts. Use progress to leverage additional progress. We
can now look at the forms for George J. In your handouts, you have both the initial and time 2 ratings for George. You also have an example of the tracking progress protocol, along with a graph of his change from time 1 to time 2 on total scores for problem severity. Finally, we produced the clinical significance graph with both his and his mother's scores. As you can see, he was classified as making no change for both his and his mother's ratings. Interestingly, his mother suggests that he has worsened in his symptoms, while he suggests that he has improved. The connection of clinical supervision to client outcome is rarely considered. By and large, supervision is connected with the outcome of the supervision. That is, did the supervisee change? Rather than connecting the supervision to whether the client of the supervisee actually changed. With outcome data readily available for clients, however, it can be used in practice even if it's not available. Cases are provided in the 10. Each supervisor may select different cases for different reasons, but my experience is about 4 cases, maybe 5, are the most likely candidates for review that are selected uniformly across individuals. Take time now to review the questions for the aggregate example number 1. The Ohio Department of Mental Health outcome scores, outcome or other variables. Aggregate example 3 provides 2 graphs for girls who were either referred by the court or some other source. A second sheet also provides actual data for discharged youth over several months in 2 separate programs. The table illustrates the reliable and outcomes, and in the middle, the average rate of change that is used for each therapist that had at least 15 clients out of 65 therapists in an agency. As you can see, the differences are rather dramatic between the best and the poorest therapist, and deserve further investigation into the reasons for that, and perhaps intervention with the therapist that had the poorest outcomes. This type of analysis will be available for both programs and clinicians in the future. It will allow us to help inform and improve treatment. Similar types of analysis could be conducted comparing agencies as well. This is the end of our final section. Outcome data can be used in its more traditional form on an aggregate basis to inform policy change, administrative decision-making, and marketing. We would still like to focus on the primary purpose of using the outcome data, and that is to engage the family in the treatment and to assess the progress with them. But nevertheless, we have these other ways of using outcome data in supervision and in aggregate form. This concludes our presentation. We hope you've enjoyed it. We have on our final slide some additional resources for those of you who are adventurous enough to pursue further information. Charlotte and I hope this training has been useful to you. As you can gather, we believe that outcome data can be used in a variety of ways to improve services and to empower and engage families without becoming a major impediment to the treatment. We hope you can see that more clearly too.
I appreciate being here today and appreciate and would like to say for all families, it feels good to know that we are heard, that we have a voice, and that we are on the front line with you. We're with those children 24/7, and we appreciate being appreciated.
Thank you.